In November of 2011, Bethesda Game Studios rocked the gaming landscape with the release of Skyrim. Not only was it an incredible commercial success, but for Bethesda, it was also the culmination of over a decade spent building their reputation as one of the best developers in the industry. No one made games quite like Bethesda did, and their unique RPG formula was the gold standard that dominated the genre. With their reputation at an all-time high after Skyrim, it was hard to imagine that Bethesda could do any wrong. The ensuing hype for their next game, another sequel in the already legendary Fallout franchise, was astronomical. Fallout 4 ended up selling extremely well, and its reception was generally positive. But some cracks were starting to show in Bethesda's once infallible RPG formula. The game engine was suddenly looking dated, the writing quality looked amateurish compared to its industry peers, and perhaps most importantly, by the time 2015 rolled around, Bethesda wasn't the only company making rich, exciting open world RPGs anymore. In short, they had kind of lost their competitive advantage. Instead of recognizing the need to up their game in the face of rising competition, they tried to bring back the same formula once again 8 years later, and, well, we all know how that went. At this point, some of you are probably wondering what any of this has to do with Elden Ring, or Shadow of the Erdtree. But I hope you can see some of the parallels between Bethesda's rise to dominance during the 2000s to that of From Software's throughout the 2010s. Both companies had unique formulas that their fans couldn't get enough of. Both peaked with a once in a generation game release that cemented their place among the industry greats. And yes, both companies reached a point not long after where their iconic formulas began to stagnate. And unfortunately for From Software, that point is the Shadow of the Erdtree DLC. But before I can explain why it started to stagnate, I should probably share my own experience with this expansion. Like many FromSoft fans, I was beyond excited to finally get some new Elden Ring content after 2 long years, and with my first playthrough clocking in at a whopping 35 hours, Shadow of the Erdtree more than lived up to its billing as FromSoft's biggest expansion to date. Unfortunately, once the novelty of the first playthrough started to wear off, it became clear that it was also not their best. I've now played the DLC a total of 4 times, and the more hours I put into it, the harder it becomes to ignore some of the really problematic design trends that have manifested in this expansion. I do want to be clear though, I do not think that Shadow of the Erdtree is a bad piece of content. Nor is this video intended to be a pessimistic dump on FromSoft as I've seen some creators doing. But I am going to be blunt and honest with my critiques because I think there are some things in this DLC that the community and even FromSoft themselves need to start reckoning with. I've split this video up into different parts for flow and ease of consumption, but without further ado, let's jump in by discussing the things Shadow of the Erdtree gets right. To the surprise of absolutely no one, Shadow of the Erdtree is visually stunning. FromSoft has proven once again that you don't need the highest fidelity graphics or most detailed shadows when every shot, landscape, and level is crafted with such a strong artistic vision. Everything in this DLC looks incredible, and there is only one exception to that I will discuss later because it ties in better to another topic. The new music in the DLC is equally great. Just the DLC soundtrack alone spans 36 tracks, and a number of the new pieces are among my favorites that FromSoft has ever released. But we all know that this DLC looks and sounds amazing. It's pretty on par for FromSoft at this point, so let's move on to the new RPG elements. Without a doubt, the most impressive part of Shadow of the Erdtree in terms of gameplay is how many cool new build options there are in a game already brimming with player freedom. Everything, and I mean everything regarding character building from the base game has been expanded on here. There's dozens of new weapons, new spells, talismans, crafting items, ashes of war, armor sets, and physic tiers. I tried my best to use all the new DLC content as much as possible, but even after my full 4 playthroughs, there is a whole list of stuff that I've barely even gotten around to yet. I did, however, make sure to try out all of the 8 new weapon classes, and they are awesome. The new martial arts aren't nearly as gimmicky as I expected, and can actually be very strong with the right setup. Great katanas and the light greatswords both offer a good balance of speed, range, and power that can be adapted to a variety of different playstyles. The backhand blades offer some good speed and an ability to close gaps quickly. The dueling shields are also super fun, and I love the idea of blending offense and defense together in a single tool. The beast claws were interesting. I didn't get along with them too well at first because I didn't like how much they make your character jump all over the place, but they actually do track enemies pretty well, and they can close gaps a lot more effectively than other fist type weapons, so I guess you could say that they've grown on me. The smithing dagger still isn't very good, sadly. It just doesn't deal enough damage to really feel that viable, but maybe that will get fixed in patches because the idea is pretty cool. And then finally, there's the perfume bottles. While a little weak, I do think having builds centered entirely around proccing different status effects is a neat idea. So overall, these new weapon classes were among the highlights of the DLC for me. Each of them felt distinct from pretty much anything in the base game, and it does seem like they were designed specifically with a higher player skill ceiling in mind, which is also something I very much appreciate. And once again, these are just the new DLC weapon classes. There's just so much stuff to play around with, it's insane. But I think my favorite singular addition in this DLC is the deflecting hard tier. I gotta be completely honest, when I first saw this thing drop from the Furnace Golem, I assumed that it would be one of those gimmick items that was actually pretty bad in practice, and so I never used it until my third playthrough, only to discover that it was without a doubt one of the best additions to the Souls combat formula maybe ever. The flexibility of being able to switch between blocks and dodges seamlessly is a godsend that makes combat feel so much more fun and more dynamic than ever before. It was such a refreshing change, being able to do more than just press the roll button in response to every single move. If that wasn't enough, with proper mastery, this tier can turn some of the DLC's fiercest bosses into a cakewalk, thanks to the boost that it gives to guard counters. The whole thing is such a game changer for combat that I can't help but feel a little dismayed that it wasn't in the game from day one, and the fact that it's tied to a physic tier that only lasts 5 minutes is a real shame. I get that they probably didn't want to make shields irrelevant, but it just sucks that players don't have the option of making this ability a permanent part of the playstyle. Still, I'm glad that it's here, and I do not exaggerate in the slightest when I say the DLC might be worth the price of admission just for this item alone. Something I'm a lot less thrilled about though is the new progression system with the revered spirit ashes and the shadow tree fragments. On paper, it's a very familiar concept from Sekiro, but sadly they really stumbled on the execution. In Sekiro, the vast majority of the prayer beads and memories were locked behind beating bosses as a way to balance out the progression. It made overcoming those grueling challenges feel genuinely rewarding with ways to increase your character's power. In Shadow of the Erdtree, that nuance was completely ignored in favor of just throwing Shadow Tree fragments all over the place, with less than half of the fragments requiring even a slight bit of combat to acquire. While Sekiro encouraged you to engage with the game's content, the Shadow Tree system almost does the opposite. It disincentivizes engaging with bosses or fighting enemies and just running around the world in favor of finding some stat buffs in some obscure corner. Players can do this in the main game also for golden seeds or sacred tier pickups, but at least those don't provide you just an across the board stat buff. you still need to engage with the content and actually fight stuff in order to level up your character. This allowed the main game to strike such an excellent balance between exploration and combat. Both were an integral part of the experience, and while I don't dislike the Erdtree system in principle, I just feel like it skews progression a little bit too heavily towards pure exploration, to the point where players who are looking for ways to increase their power are more likely to spend hours wandering around on Torrent than they are to actually go into a dungeon and fight stuff. And I can't help but wonder if the reason it was laid out this way is because FromSoft needed some incentive for players to actually explore this new open world. And that leads me very nicely along to my next topic. I loved the scale and spectacle of Elden Ring's massive open world, and the freedom that that provided for exploration and game progression. But for the world to be mostly desolate and devoid of typical RPG activities like NPC settlements, lengthy quest lines, or minigames, it was always going to be a challenge for FromSoft to fill all of that space with meaningful content. All things considered, the main game did a pretty good job by spreading out its major points of interest and dotting the remaining space with a strong helping of field bosses, mini dungeons, caves, tower puzzles, and more. Despite this, there was still a lot of what I would consider empty time in the main game, areas where there just wasn't much to see or do other than ride through on Torrent in the direction of something more interesting. I found this especially prevalent in the Liurnia, mountaintops, and snowfield areas. While I would consider it a little more than a minor annoyance, it was definitely something I picked up on the more I replayed the base game. So I was really excited when one of the promised features leading into the DLC was that the world would be denser and smaller. A similar sense of scale, but without as much empty space, sounded like the best of both worlds for me, and I was eagerly awaiting to see what the DLC map would be like to explore. So, did it live up to my expectations? Well, yes and no. I'm a bit conflicted about this topic, and I struggled for a while to decide exactly how I wanted to present it, but I'll just talk about the good stuff first. The DLC is absolutely massive in scope, easily the size of several of the main game's regions put together. But what's more impressive than its large expanse is just how deep and vertical the map is. Exploring it reminded me of the Metroidvania-style world design from all the way back in Dark Souls 1, where the map was a complex spiderweb of intermingling pathways leading in every which way before eventually looping back on each other. They really were able to capture that same sense of wonder of exploration that the base game had, and did so while still experimenting with some awesome new ideas, like the increased verticality and even some non-traditional legacy dungeons like the Raw Ruins. They even blurred the line between side content and main content with the new catacombs, jails, and forges dungeons. These are vastly improved versions of their main game counterparts, and they actually felt rewarding to find and explore these side dungeons this time around. The layouts are much larger and more unique, the enemy variety is better, and end bosses are, for the most part, actually compelling. Two of these side dungeons even connect directly to some of the DLC's biggest areas of content, which is the kind of thing that makes exploration feel so worthwhile when you stumble into these huge new areas out of what you thought was just a small side cave. Out of all the new side dungeons, there was only one of them that I felt underwhelmed by, and I was overall really happy with how much effort was put into these this time around. But like with any FromSoft game, the main attraction will always be the legacy dungeons. I'm talking about areas like Bellarat, the Shadowkeep, Castellensis. All of these are the clearest and most straightforward examples of the more traditional, structured areas that FromSoft is known for, and they definitely live up to FromSoft's reputation for top-notch level design. In fact, the Shadowkeep, Church District, and Specimen Storehouse, when combined, might just be my favorite legacy dungeon in the entire game. The way they all connect with each other, have all this cool stuff to explore, is truly incredible, and it's on par with, honestly, some of FromSoft's best level design work ever. There's no doubt in my mind that this sequence of areas is my favorite part of the whole DLC, especially since it caps off with one of the game's best bosses. Bellarat and Alir Ilum have a similar idea of being two distinct areas that interconnect together, and it's a concept I definitely would like to see more of in FromSoft's future projects. Even some of the shorter, more linear dungeons like the Jagged Peak and the Stone Coffin Fissure still serve their purposes well and have very memorable design. Much like the base game, it's clear that these major story zones are where most of the development time and resources went into, and they are once again the highlights of the overall experience as a result. The legacy dungeons and side dungeons are all huge positives for the DLC, but in the grand scheme of things, these only comprise a small portion of the total map. And unfortunately, the remainder is where the issues start to materialize. In between its major points of interest, the Land of Shadow feels very hollow and empty. The southern coast areas are a very commonly cited example of this. It's very pretty indeed, but there are very few structures or anything to draw players' attention, and even most of the enemies and bosses that are there are just recycled from the main game. I generally don't mind some reused assets to fill in gaps here or there in such a massive world, but the amount of reuse concentrated in these areas are what make me think that they kind of just ran out of time for this region, which is a huge shame because it's so breathtaking visually. But the southern coast is far from the only example of this problem. The Abyssal Woods is a very cool zone from a gameplay and atmosphere standpoint, but the ratio of size to content feels way off here too. The forest spans a huge section of the map despite containing only 2 structures, including the shortest legacy dungeon in the DLC. Aside from those 2 structures, there is only 1 Shadow Tree fragment, 1 NPC fight, and a couple of cookbooks scattered throughout this massive, mostly empty space that you have to traverse on foot. I get the idea was probably to make players feel helpless and lost, but there are better examples of these types of areas in the series that don't rely on being so barren. The Forbidden Woods in Bloodborne has far more content in terms of both combat and exploration, and has a much more interesting layout to boot, all while being probably about 1/3 of the size of the Abyssal Woods. But I think the worst offender for me is the northeast hinterlands region. This is one of the very last places I discovered in the whole DLC, and I was so excited to see what it had to offer. So you can imagine my disappointment when I was only met with 2 lore dump areas and 2 recycled main game mini-bosses. That's it. I love the Shaman Village for what it is, but for this entire region to bring literally nothing in terms of new gameplay is very disappointing. So the Hinterlands, Abyssal Woods, and Southern Coast represent what I would consider the most egregious areas that just feel way too empty in terms of the amount of content they offer. But it really is a persistent problem everywhere, and to prove it, let's compare the density and side content in the DLC versus just one single region of the main game. Let's take Limgrave, for example. Even if we disregard the Weeping Peninsula entirely, the Limgrave area has 24 side bosses in it, as in bosses that do not drop a remembrance. Meanwhile, in the DLC, despite it being several times larger than Limgrave, only has 30 side bosses in total. In Limgrave, there are 9 side dungeons, such as caves, catacombs, or heroes' graves, while by my count, Shadow of the Erdtree only has 11 of these dotted throughout the map. This is not to mention all of the churches, ruins, and other smaller structures that the main game has in spades that are far less common in the DLC too. And in case you think I'm just cherry picking Limgrave as the comparable, I would challenge you to run this same exercise with any major region in the main game, and I guarantee you will come up with comparable results. I look at how much more intricate the dungeons are in the DLC and how much more complex the map layout is, and it really does seem like FromSoft tried to take a quality over quantity approach with the side content this time around. I'm all in favor of that, but they stretched themselves way too thin, trying to spread the content they had over such a massive space. The end result is unfortunately a case of 1 step forward, 2 steps back. The steady supply of repetitive but ultimately serviceable side content from the main game has been replaced by large stretches of mostly nothing at all in between the major points of interest. It doesn't help either that most of the cool new loot I was raving about earlier is also heavily concentrated in the game's major dungeons. Cookbooks or crafting materials are just not meaningful enough as rewards for exploring out in the world, especially with how grindy some of the new consumables are. It's so weird that Shadow of the Erdtree can have so much content in it, yet still suffer from this persistent feeling of emptiness. They had almost 2.5 years to put this thing together. That's more than double the time that CD Projekt Red had to create the similarly massive Blood and Wine expansion for The Witcher 3. I feel like FromSoft just misjudged the scope of this project in a big way, and underestimated the amount of content they would need to effectively populate such a massive space. As if the emptiness in the DLC wasn't bad enough on its own, it has a ripple effect on so many of the other issues this DLC suffers from, some of which I haven't even addressed yet. The need to have Shadow Tree fragments being so spread out all over the place, the copious reuse of main game assets to fill in areas, the performance problems that many players have suffered from, and some of the DLC's fragmented storytelling are just some of the additional issues that can be all traced back to how big they tried to make it. The promise of a smaller and denser map made me so excited because it was an opportunity to take an already legendary game and push it to that next level by addressing one of the most common complaints about the main game. But for all the discussion the DLC has generated in the community about bosses and difficulty, it really is the emptiness throughout its world and in between all those bosses that remains its biggest shortcoming for me. But trust me, we will be talking about bosses soon, though not quite yet, because first, I need to rant about lore. I want to start off this section by clarifying that I am not the biggest lore buff when it comes to FromSoft. This is not my area of expertise, but what I do care about is narrative consistency. And unfortunately, Elden Ring's storyline has been completely torn to shreds by this DLC. FromSoft always has a tendency to make their expansions feel pretty disconnected from the main storyline, so that they can stand strong on their own. They're side stories, and generally pretty good ones too. But the big difference here in Shadow of the Erdtree is that this is not a side story, the way that Dark Souls or Bloodborne's DLCs were. Maybe the Mesmer and Shadow Realm stuff could have been a side story, but Miquella's story has pretty massive implications for pretty much everyone in the lands between, and it's taking place during the events of the main game. Treating the DLC as its own standalone story doesn't work when you're dealing with something so heavily intertwined with the main narrative. And the fact that they still structured it as if it was a standalone story creates all kinds of problems. For example, how on earth are neither Mesmer or the Hornsent mentioned a single time in the base game? Based on the DLC's own lore, both were common knowledge in the lands between, and many characters that we meet in-game should absolutely know about this stuff. Especially Melina, given that it's implied she's Mesmer's sister, and yet she has absolutely nothing to say about any of this. Alternatively, if no one in the lands between knows about the Realm of Shadow other than Marika, well then how did Miquella find out about it? And while we're on that topic, how did he even get to the Gate of Divinity without burning the Sealing Tree? Like, how did he do it? I have no idea. Why can't we tell Gideon literally anything about Miquella after he explicitly asks us to look for him in the main game? Why does Ronnie take no interest in the fate of her brother or Miquella's plan, even though it poses a major threat to her own ambitions? I could go on, but I think you get my point by now. The choice to keep the DLC and main story separated ends up not hurting just the DLC, it hurts the main game too, possibly even more so because it's like the story is almost retroactively creating plot holes for itself. Instead of the DLC being the last pieces we need to finish the puzzle, it's as if someone just dumped a brand new set of pieces on the table and asked us to combine it with what's already assembled. And nowhere is this sentiment more evident than with the DLC's final boss. Let me be clear, the problem with Radahn from a story perspective is not that it doesn't make sense. It's that the main game never, even a single time, implied a connection between Miquella and Radahn. I mean, sure, this reveal does provide some much needed context for why Malenia and Radahn fought in the first place, but the story behind the fight is still completely hollow because there isn't even the slightest hint of any connection between Miquella and Radahn until halfway through the DLC. By which point the reveal just makes it way too obvious where things are headed. Either way, it comes too far out of left field to hit home as a strong revelation. When it comes to writing, a good plot twist doesn't just hinge on surprise and shock value. It needs to be built on pre-established story to subvert audience expectations in a clever way. Let's look at a really famous example of what I mean.
I am your father.
This is a pretty great reveal. It's so famous, in fact, that even non-Star Wars fans have probably heard of it. But let me ask you a simple question. If Luke's father had not been mentioned a single time until halfway through that film, would the reveal have been as iconic as it was? I think most of you can recognize that of course it wouldn't. The reason why it works as well as it does is specifically because the writers put in the work to build up the intrigue of Luke's parentage basically since the very beginning. Fromsoft's decision to not do any setup aside from a character quest very late in the DLC means we get the opposite of what they probably intended. It ends up robbing much of the impact from the reveal because there's almost nothing we can relate it back to. And don't even get me started on the questions of why Mikola concocted this ridiculous plan in the first place. Like, if he had the power to essentially mind control people, including demigods, why even bother with all this nonsense in the realm of Shadow when the Elden throne was ripe for the taking? Like, he literally could have just become Elden Lord and ushered in his Age of Compassion that way. But I digress, that's a whole other can of worms that I'm not going to get into here. My point is that the Radahn reveal is sloppy storytelling at best, and at worst, it looks like they were just making things up as they went along. It doesn't help that after the Radahn fight, the DLC ends very abruptly. Again, this is typical for FromSoft DLCs. All of their past expansions end pretty unceremoniously after the last boss. But given the massive story implications of what happens at the end here, it's just a bit jarring not to be able to get any closure or even interact with the Gate of Divinity at all. It's another instance of FromSoft approaching the story in the DLC just the same way they always have, and that's a bit unfortunate when I feel like this story demanded a more substantial revolution given its stakes. But I've railed against the negatives of this story long enough. How about the stuff it gets right? Because there is some stuff it gets right. This is easily one of the best rosters of NPCs that FromSoft has ever created. All of their personalities are compelling, I like how their quests interconnect with each other, and the fact that their quest progression also has a tangible impact on the Leda fight at the end is a really cool idea. It's a way of making NPC quest lines feel more relevant and worthwhile than they ever have in the past, and it ended up making for a really memorable set piece at the end. I wouldn't say getting ganked by up to 5 super tanky NPCs is my definition of the most fun gameplay in FromSoft history, but if there was ever an NPC fight that gets a pass from me, this might be it. The unique story context is more than enough to carry the fight, even if I don't like the gameplay that much. There are also a handful of narrative high points in the DLC lore. Learning the truth behind Mohg's actions, the Mother of Fingers and the abandonment by the Greater Will, the fate of Marika's people, and Bale's rivalry with Placidusax are all excellent story beats that hit home in a compelling way. I think it's pretty telling that these are some of the DLC's most memorable moments, even if they didn't have a huge impact on the overall story. They work well because they provided satisfying answers to questions that we had going in, and they tie into things that we already understood about the base game. It's just a shame that the writers didn't take this approach more consistently. The sad thing is, almost all of the issues the DLC story suffers from are really the fault of decisions made during development of the main game. I know that at the end of the day, this is FromSoft. It would not be realistic to expect all of the answers to be neatly presented in a straightforward manner, but Shadow of the Erdtree still seems like a step back for them in terms of storytelling because of how they chose to segment off the content. A little bit of proper setup in the main game, plus a few additional dialogue options with NPCs post DLC launch, might have been all this story needed to really shine. But who knows, like I said, lore is not really my strong suit, so maybe in a few months the lore buffs will figure out how this all actually does make sense and I'll just look like an idiot. But in the meantime, let's move on to our last topic, and the one that I'm definitely a lot more personally familiar with, and that'll be the bosses. Without a doubt, the most divisive aspect of Shadow of the Erdtree from the second it launched is its major bosses. Everything about the aggressiveness and intensity of the hardest fights from the main game have been cranked up to 11 in the DLC. This has raised all sorts of discussions about difficulty and what makes From Software bosses engaging in the first place. Personally, I love learning a boss's moveset, getting into a good flow state, and then being able to truly master all of the fights. That appeal of mastery is exactly why my fourth playthrough was at Rune Level 1, and for good measure, I did not acquire any Shadow Tree blessings either. I wanted to know these bosses inside and out, not just for my own satisfaction, but also for the sake of this video. So while I don't expect everyone will agree with my opinions on the bosses, I do think it's important to clarify that I have a pretty thorough understanding of how these fights work. So what better place to start than with the DLC's lightning rod for controversy, Promised Consort Radahn. If you think Malenia was a divisive boss, then she has nothing on Radahn. For the most part, I actually really like Radahn. His kit is really good, his combos are fast and fun to dodge, I like the way he mixes up regular melee with gravity and blood magic, and I don't even mind his holy follow-ups in Phase 2. I think it's a cool way of building on the Phase 1 moveset by forcing players to consider both timing and positioning on each dodge. Given that it's the last boss of a massive DLC, I don't think such a challenge is unreasonable. Besides, we all know it would be a little bit disappointing on some level if there wasn't anything in the DLC that was at least as challenging as Malenia. But unfortunately, that push to maximize difficulty is where Radahn's flaws start to show up. For one, the visual effects in Phase 2 make some of his attacks really difficult to read. And by that I don't mean in an, oh, I just can't get that timing down sort of way, but more like a, what the hell is even happening, what did I get hit by kind of way. This clone charge move, for example, is an attack that, even after seeing it dozens if not hundreds of times by now, I have no idea what the actual hitbox is or why walking to the right keeps me perfectly safe, since it looks like he still charges right through me. Visual clarity is very important in Fromsoft games, and usually they're very good at allowing players to easily identify why they took damage in any given instance and adapt to it. But in cases like this, it becomes a frustrating guessing game of trying to figure out hitboxes with trial and error until something works. Now this issue is not exclusive to Radahn. I don't even think he's the worst example of it necessarily, but it is pervasive throughout the DLC. And if you remember way back from the beginning when I talked about there being one exception to the amazing art direction in the DLC, this would be it. It's stuff like this that makes people feel like a boss's difficulty is just being artificially inflated, and much the same could be said for undodgeable moves like Radahn's cross/slash combo. If you dodge the first swipe of this combo, you will get caught by the second, and if you wait for the second, you will not have time to avoid the first. You can't outspace it because it's way too fast and has way too much range. It can't be strafed because it tracks extremely heavily, and it cannot be jumped over either. Unless you're in a couple of very specific weird spots next to his sides, it is literally an undodgeable move. Normally I would not have an issue with positioning being the right answer, but the attack starts up so fast that unless you're already standing in the right spot when he starts it, you're going to be out of luck. So if you want to actually deal with this move appropriately with just dodging, you really don't have any other solution other than to just constantly be rotating around him the entire time. A slightly longer startup might have been all this move needed to function perfectly fine. If it just gave the player enough time to reposition themselves accordingly, I don't think I would have much of an issue with it. But as of now, it just feels like it has an overbearing influence on the overall fight, which in my opinion is ridiculous. This is not like Nihil, which is a scripted once per move fight, nor is it something like Waterfowl, which is a boss's signature move that the entire fight is built around. This is just a basic move that Radahn can throw out literally whenever he wants, and it makes me almost wonder if this move is even working as intended. It just baffles the mind that something like this is literally harder to dodge than Waterfowl. As it stands now, I am firmly in the camp that the cross slash is a terrible move, and I blight on the fight along with the obnoxious tracking and over the top recovery cancellations that some of Radon's other moves have too. It also seems like some of Radon's hitboxes are simply broken, or no status effects at all. Um, dude! There are a lot of problems with this fight. There's no way around that, but despite all of the issues, I still find Radon to be a very satisfying challenge to cap the DLC. So my overall impressions of the fight are still mostly positive. It's just a shame that FromSoft's desire to clearly push the difficulty as far as it could possibly go here feels like it came at the cost of what otherwise might have been one of the series' greatest battles. Alright, I'm gonna try and be a little bit shorter with the other bosses. I just had a lot to say about Radon since he is the one that's most talked about, but how about we move on to the Dancing Lion? This is a fight I want to like a lot more than I do. I love the music, and switching between the various elements is a great way to keep the fight consistently fresh. However, it's one of the messiest fights maybe in FromSoft history in terms of visuals. Not only are there an insane amount of visual effects on screen, but the beast itself is an unfortunate combination of big and fast that does not play very well with the camera, regardless of whether you were playing locked on or not. It doesn't help matters that the boss's limbs are almost completely obscured, so while in motion it just looks like a giant blob of horns, hair, and cloth flying all over the place. You can still learn its patterns, of course, but so many of my deaths feel like they come as a result of just not being able to see the boss properly, either because of the camera, the visuals, its design, or all of the above. And don't even get me started on the random lightning littering the arena in the lightning phase. It is by far the worst aspect of the fight in my opinion, because there is absolutely no counterplay to it. As far as I can tell, it seems to be completely random. So sometimes you'll perfectly dodge an attack from the beast only to get your cheeks clapped by some random lightning strike that you might not have even been able to see. Some of his hitboxes are also a bit questionable, and his breath attack seems like it's completely undodgeable up close, or although that one might just be a skill issue on my end. All of these issues with the fight coalesce into something that I just do not enjoy as a whole. I think for a while I gaslit myself into thinking I liked this fight because most people seem to like it, but the more I fight him, the more I struggle to understand where all that enjoyment comes from. Maybe the theme and the element switching is enough for some people, or maybe it's just a skill issue and I'm just bad at this fight, who knows. But what I can say is that it is by far my least favorite remembrance fight in the DLC, and maybe even in Elden Ring as a whole. R'Lana, on the other hand, was one of my favorites in the DLC. At the start, she seemed utterly overwhelming with high aggression, strong magic, and seemingly endless combos. But the more I learned to master her moveset, the more opportunities to counter revealed themselves, until the fight eventually settled into a great back and forth flow that is synonymous with the very best FromSoft bosses. I also really like how this fight utilizes jumping, with many attacks that can be jumped over for optimal punishes. There is only one flaw in this fight for me, and it's her quick uppercut double slash that she can do when you're up close. While not quite as hard to dodge as Radon's cross slash, this move comes out incredibly fast, and even if you are fast enough to avoid the initial, your roll will be caught by the second swipe. The only consistent way I found to avoid it was to completely back off after each punish and wait for her to come to me. This hurt the flow of what was otherwise an incredibly engaging fight, but it's not enough to knock her off of being one of my favorites. But what will knock a boss's quality for me are attacks that just feel cheap. Now, obviously that's a bit subjective, but the Erdtree avatar has some of the most obnoxiously delayed attacks that I've ever seen. The charge, the grab, and the flashbang in phase 3 are all examples of extremely lengthy delays where the boss is just sitting there baiting you for several seconds to the point where the animation just looks silly. And what's even more frustrating is they're all distance based, so you can't even weave counterattacks on your own while you wait. The thorn attacks are yet another example of some pretty messy visual effects. Sometimes I'll take a hit from them and have absolutely no idea why. I swear sometimes they loop around from behind me to hit me, but but I can't even really tell because it all just looks like a blob of vines on the screen. Now, all that being said, I do think this is a neat implementation of a 3-phase boss idea. I like that the flower's moveset grows more and more erratic and desperate with each phase, especially with the accompanying music shifts. Also, as far as big monster bosses go, the camera is actually pretty good here, and the fact that each phase ends with an optional riposte to make each subsequent phase easier is a nice detail too. So there are some good ideas in this fight, to be sure. It's just a shame that they're marred by a lot of frustrating issues with visuals and some really annoying attacks. The Putrescent Knight was another weird one for me. He also has what I would consider to be a few obnoxiously long delays on his attacks, but the more I fought him, the more I found that the fight settled into a pretty comfortable rhythm that could actually be pretty fun. I don't take much issue with any of his moves now, except for the triple fire AoE in phase 2. The visual cue for it is so weird, I have no idea what the hitbox is. I swear half the time I avoid damage even though I'm literally standing in the fire when it reaches me. So there's just something about the way it spreads, I think, that does not match the visual cue, and it makes dodging it feel very awkward. For being the capstone fight at the end of a very long journey down the coast, I was hoping for something a little bit more substantial than this. I do think the boss is fine as is, like its moveset is fine, but I feel like this boss would be much better suited as like a mid-dungeon fight like Margit or Red Wolf were, that you fight on your way to something greater. I do feel like he's not exactly worthy of being a capstone level fight. Speaking of fights that feel a little underwhelming, Commander Gaius straight up should not be a remembrance boss. The fight leads to nothing, the arena is extremely dull, and he doesn't even have his own musical theme. The moveset also has a few pretty serious warts. The charge that he can just pull out whenever he wants feels cheap, and it has an absolutely brutal hitbox. His back leg kick comes out way too quickly to the point where sometimes it'll catch you right in the middle of an animation. And his wombo combo where he just flails around seems like it's borderline undodgeable if you're standing in the wrong spot when he starts it. Fortunately, the rest of his kit actually is pretty fun. I do think he provides pretty consistent punish windows, his gravity mix-up in phase 2 are cool, and the fight generally does have a good flow to it. It's just a shame that it's weighed down by a few really bad moves. He's still a far cry from my favorite boss in the DLC, and I think the remembrance is a bit tacked on, but as long as he's not spamming his problematic moves too much, I do think this fight can actually be pretty fun. Much like Putrescent Knight though, does not feel worthy of being a capstone fight. But let's change gears here and talk about Midra, the Lord of Frenzied Flame. Not only is this my favorite boss in the DLC, he might be my new favorite in all of Elden Ring. His intro cutscene is fantastic, the design is super cool, the visual effects are awesome but don't clutter up the screen too much, his soundtrack is phenomenal, but most importantly, he is the only boss in the whole DLC where I have exactly zero complaints about the moveset. He moves around in this eerie, unnatural manner that extends to his attack animations, but it never comes at the cost of his moves being readable. Even his frenzy AoEs have very natural dodge timings with hitboxes that accurately match the animations. He has a handful of optional combo extensions to keep you on your toes, but there are still very consistent openings for retaliation, and it facilitates an excellent back and forth rhythm to the fight. He's not that hard, all things considered, but I think more than anything, this fight serves to show that Fromsoft doesn't always need to crank the difficulty up to 11 with tacked on mechanics or cheap tricks to make a fight memorable. Sometimes a good fight just stands on its own, and Midra definitely does. And a lot of the things that make Midra such an amazing fight can be very much applied to Mesmer as well. The presentation, the music, the moveset, it's all awesome here too. There are only two flaws with Mesmer that keep him from being top of the pack for me. For one, some of his hitboxes are outright terrible, especially in phase 2 with the snakes. This is also yet another boss that has absurd tracking where you'll see him break the laws of physics to hit you with his spear if you mistime your roll by even a quarter second. It feels like being able to avoid attacks with good positioning is simply not practical in this fight, which is a shame because Mesmer being a spear wielder would have made this the perfect fight to implement some strafable moves. Funny enough, I don't actually have much else to say about Mesmer, because a lot of it would just be repeating what I just said about Midra. So despite a couple minor blemishes, Mesmer definitely lives up to the hype, and it is a fantastic fight to cap off the DLC's best area. Okay, next up is Romina, and honestly, I completely rewrote this section in the middle of editing because my original script for it made it sound like I absolutely hated this boss, which is not true. I complained about her feeling out of place and too easy, and that she stalls too much in second phase, and what I didn't talk about is the fact that I actually otherwise really enjoy this fight. Like, the positives vastly outweigh the negatives. Her moveset is really fun, the visuals are cool, the music is great. There's some surprising complexity to some of her moves, which makes it a really fun fight to master. So yeah, it's just a really fun fight. That's not to say my criticisms are still not there. I do wish she was a little bit harder. I do wish she stalled a little bit less in phase 2, but overall I am really, really happy with this boss, and it is one of the better ones in the DLC. So hopefully this paragraph actually reflects that properly now. I still think she's missing a little something, but overall it's still a lot of fun, and that's what matters most. A fight that is definitely not missing anything, though, is Bale. I wouldn't say Bale is a flawless fight, but it scores high enough in terms of presentation and moveset to be one of my favorites in the DLC. The build up, for one, is one of the most epic lead ups to any boss in Fromsoft history, and the fight doesn't disappoint either. He has a pretty deep move pool with a good mix of easy to read attacks mixed in with some more complex patterns that are tough, but never cross the line into feeling unfair. The relatively slow and more methodical pace of this fight is also a nice change from some of the overwhelmingly relentless bosses throughout Shadow of the Erdtree. The visuals are flashy but not overwhelming, and his Phase 2 transition might be my favorite in the expansion. There are, however, a couple attacks in Phase 2 where, I gotta be honest, the hitbox simply does not match the visual, and I had to point these ones out because they're just so incredibly egregious. Like, how is this attack jumpable? I know it shows the ground rising up, but the idea of jumping over this and not getting burned by the literal nuke going off just makes it look silly. Like, how are players honestly supposed to intuit this? The complete opposite is true for his flying breath attack. The first breath comes out in a wave along the ground, but for some reason this is not jumpable, at least as far as I'm aware, even though it really looks like it should be. I do want to clarify, once I learned to deal with these attacks, they function perfectly fine, but they are more examples to add to the list of visual cues that are just a little bit off in this DLC compared to the main game. The only other problem I have with Bale is some of his combos end with him just jumping to the other side of the arena, instead of just having him stop and letting me hit him. This is another case of what I would consider to be excessive stalling, and it is completely unnecessary, but it's not as egregious as some bosses like Elden Beast. And none of these complaints are enough to truly take away from Bale's status as being one of From's best ever dragon fights. He stands tall as a great example of how to blend presentation, mechanics, and storytelling to create a truly unforgettable battle. The last major boss in the DLC is Metter, and I saved her for last because as cool as the fight is from a lore perspective, I don't really have much to say about the actual boss itself. I think it's smart that they made her stomach a weak point to keep you centered on her, and her moveset is generally fine, but she doesn't bring much to the table that we haven't seen from dozens of other big beast bosses at this point. Unfortunately, her quality is absolutely cratered by what is possibly the most egregious undodgeable move in the whole game. Her Phase 2 laser is completely undodgeable, unless you are either literally on the other side of the arena from her when she starts it, or you use one of two specific Ashes of War to push through it. I have absolutely no idea what the intended response to this move is for melee players, other than just to constantly run away in Phase 2, which obviously is stupid. Maybe they felt the need to put in a move like this because the boss is relatively easy otherwise, but more health or a more nuanced moveset would have been much better solutions. To that end, I can't help but feel like Meter is quite disappointing as a whole. Okay, so that covers all 11 major bosses, and I would say for the most part I'm pretty happy with these fights. I do think some fall a little bit short in terms of their presentation compared to the main game, And there are some very persistent issues, such as the inconsistent and overwhelming visual effects, bad hitboxes, some wonky tracking, and the blatantly undodgeable moves here and there, which, now that I think about it, a lot of these issues could be additional effects of them just not having enough time to properly playtest all of the fights. My critic brain makes it hard for me to ignore all of these problematic trends, but at the end of the day, I had more than enough fun with this roster of bosses to leave me quite satisfied. As for the smaller mini bosses, I would say they're very much a mixed bag, a lot like the main game. There are a few genuinely great ones, like the Death Knights, plus some creative ideas like the Lamenter and the Red Bears that I found pretty entertaining. But at the same time, there's way too many NPC fights for my liking, and while I don't mind dragon bosses as much as some, I can admit that having an additional 6 reskinned dragon fights in the DLC is not exactly what I was looking forward to. Senesax gets my vote for the worst overall fight in the whole DLC because it takes one of the most boring and awful designs from the main game and somehow made it even worse. There's also 4 recycled non-boss tree spirits, which yet again is fine. Like, they're fine enemies, but just wasn't exactly something I was jumping for joy over. And then there's the furnace golems, which I can't describe as any other way other than disappointing. I was so excited at first to take on the first one when I saw it in the gravesite plane, but I was a little less excited when I realized that it took 6 posture breaks and 2 riposts to kill it. I then became even less excited when I realized this wasn't just a spectacle fight to open the DLC, these fights are a staple of every single region. There are 8 in total, and 6 that you have to fight without the furnace pots. Now, I generally don't mind repetition in bosses if the bosses themselves are fun, like in Sekiro. But the furnace golems don't have a moveset that is nearly interesting enough to justify seeing them repeated so many times, especially with how drawn out the fights are. I really struggle to understand the rationale for not making them die after a single riposte, because the second phase doesn't really offer anything new to justify extending the length of the fight so much. So all that said, if we throw in the furnace golems and the recycled tree spirits into the mini-boss pool, the quality does drop pretty significantly. Which is unfortunate because it started out so strong with the Death Knight being one of the first mini-bosses I found. It sucks that so few others felt like they were really worth my time. But there's one other thing regarding bosses that I've largely avoided discussing until now, and that is the difficulty itself. I've mentioned it here and there with certain moves, but overall the difficulty of this DLC is what has garnered the most discussion. I want to save it to closer to the end of the video because it ties into some much broader thoughts that I have about not just this DLC, but the future of Fromsoft's games in general. I'll admit, when I first heard all of the complaining about the bosses in the DLC being too hard, I figured that it would just be a case of a few elitist players that were butthurt over a new release, forcing them out of their comfort zones. It wouldn't be the first time that's happened, and I thought that surely within a few weeks everyone would just adapt and the review scores would start to skyrocket again. But it didn't happen. Many players were citing the same problematic boss trends that I've already discussed, like the hyper-aggression, excessive tracking, distracting visuals, bad hitboxes, and poor telegraphs, as reasons for their dissatisfaction. Others have pointed the finger at Spirit Ash summons for skewing the balance for solo players in an unfair way, and some have even argued that FromSoft might just be getting lazy with their boss designs at this point. While I think there is some validity to all of these points, I also think that they're really all just symptoms of a much larger, more systemic problem that I think only just now the larger community is starting to understand. That the Souls combat formula has been pushed to its logical limits. I had an inkling after the base game that there probably wasn't much more they could do to push the combat, and the DLC has proven that intuition to be correct. Even with all the cool new weapons and the deflectability, that's not enough to fundamentally change that this combat system is a relatively simplistic one that's essentially been around since Demon Souls, almost 15 years ago now. That's 6 out of the last 7 Souls games that have been perpetuating the same combat loop, with Sekiro being really the only one that's branched off and done something systemically different with its core mechanics. And while I love the Souls combat loop as much as anyone, it's important to recognize that it does have its share of limitations, as any combat system does. The stamina bar limits how many actions players can take in a short stretch of time. Having committed inputs and input buffering limit how quickly players can react to their opponents in real time. The camera and lock-on systems in these games are not well suited for very large targets or for fighting multiple enemies at once. The basic weapon movesets are generally very limited to small 3 to 4 hit combos, which limits the skill ceiling of combat. Defensive options are also rather limited, with the dodge roll that is typically the only one that is consistent among all playstyles. This means that in theory, every single attack must be designed to accommodate the dodge roll, which once again not only further limits the skill ceiling of combat, but it also limits FromSoft's creativity in terms of what they can do with their enemy movesets. Those are just a few examples of limitations that From games have always dealt with, and there's probably a lot more. But all of that would still be fine if From were content to just continue making games within those limitations. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's clear at this point that FromSoft wants their games to continue being challenging. And not just for newcomers either, for veterans as well. Veterans who have poured hundreds, if not thousands, of hours into these games over the last 15 years, and quite frankly, we've seen it all at this point. Slow attacks, fast attacks, delayed attacks, follow-up attacks, long combos, AoEs, massive health pools, multiple phases, input reading, etc. You name it, and FromSoft have probably tried it many times over by now. So the question then is not what should FromSoft do next with its bosses to keep the challenge up, but what else can they do? Other than make combos even longer, downtime even shorter, and attack telegraphs increasingly unnatural. They've gotten a lot of mileage out of this relatively simple combat system thanks to clever iteration over the years, but there's only so far that can go when the underlying core remains the same time after time. Dark Souls 1 added poise and more weapon variety. DS2 brought in power stancing and expanded magic. Bloodborne introduced trick weapons, quick steps, and some supplemental mechanics like rallying to encourage more aggression. DS3 added weapon arts, and Elden Ring added jump attacks, guard counters, and a more robust stagger system. All of these were great additions, but none can change what the core gameplay almost always boils down to in these games. Dodge, hit, dodge, and repeat. And again, I'm saying this as someone who loves this combat loop, so I understand how reductive it can sound to lay it out like this. But the problem, again, lies in the designer's need to keep that loop both fun and challenging. And as the player base has become more and more experienced, FromSoft has had to raise the bar again and again and again to maintain that challenge. That simply can't go on forever when the core mechanics still stem from a 2009 game that was not built with this sort of high-octane action combat in mind. We've already long since reached the point where iframes are the only reason the iconic dodge mechanic even remains viable. Like, let's be honest, you don't actually dodge attacks most of the time anymore. More often than not, you roll straight through them because it's the more effective method for iframes, and it's starting to look outright goofy that you can avoid damage from stuff like this just by doing a little tuck and roll. And while boss difficulty continues to ramp up, the exploration in these games continues to get easier with each passing entry. The harsh, punishing environments that dominated the early Souls games are all but gone. Checkpoints are increasingly forgiving, and players now have easy access to infinite fast travel almost all the time. Now, these aren't necessarily bad changes in a vacuum, but I hope you can see the ripple effect that they have on the boss design philosophy. If the challenge in these games no longer comes from exploring harsh environments, and if levels are designed in such a way that you can usually sprint right through them while ignoring all of the enemies, well, that just piles even more pressure on the bosses to deliver that difficulty that the studio is known for. For Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, that approach worked wonders, but now the combat system is brushing up against the limits of what it can reasonably account for. So they need to rely on increasingly delayed and unnatural attack animations, visual effects cluttering the whole screen, borderline unavoidable attacks with very little counterplay, and minuscule player downtime to keep up any modicum of challenge. The main game of Elden Ring was not free of these problems, because like I said, these are issues that have been slowly brewing for quite some time, but the DLC definitely amplified them in a much more prominent way, and they impact the fights a lot more negatively as a result. Something has to give, and to me, the solution is clear. These games need a new combat system. I know not everyone might take kindly to that suggestion given how beloved their combat is, and again, I get it. This was a tough realization to come to myself, but I don't know what else they can do to keep these games mechanically challenging without slowly chipping away at their quality, and that's not a trade-off that I want to see. This is especially relevant now that Fromsoft no longer has a total monopoly on this genre they've created. The industry has finally caught up with them, and the last few years have seen a surge of high-quality Souls-likes from small developers that have embraced innovative ideas to put their own stamp on the formula, and fans have started to take notice. This growing competition, combined with the traditional Souls combat system starting to stagnate, and Shadow of the Erdtree being From's most controversial release in a long time, all culminate into why I think we've reached a potential tipping point for the company. The question now becomes, will they play it safe and continue to trot out the same aging formula, or can they pivot to more innovative ideas that redefine what's possible in this genre? They've already done the latter once with Sekiro, which in many ways was their most innovative project since Demon Souls. Sekiro didn't just shake up the combat, it introduced new ideas in everything from narrative to level design to traversal and more. It was a project brimming with creativity and yet still managed to be arguably their best and most polished experience to date. That's the kind of ambition I want to see in their next game. Something a little more focused and a little bit more creative and stepping away from that aging Souls combat formula that has just reached the end of the rope for me. It's not that the combat isn't fun anymore, but if FromSoft wants to continue pushing these games in a more action-oriented direction that they've been going in since Bloodborne, I think it's just sensible at this point to lean into that fully and refine the core mechanics to reflect a more action-oriented approach, which again, they did in Sekiro. Given how great Sekiro was, that alone gives me a lot of confidence that From can bounce back and continue to make genre-defying games. Miyazaki himself has even hinted that From's next project will be focused on sharpening the series' combat, and that could be just what the Doctor ordered to get FromSoft back on the right path quickly. I just really hope they're able to look past all the glowing critical reviews and the high sales, and avoid the temptation to just play it safe given Elden Ring's massive commercial appeal. Avoiding stagnation requires being proactive, making changes before the stagnation sets in too deeply, not after they spend years of hard work cranking out the next game. That's why I'm harping so strongly on the need to make these changes now, while the issues are still minor and before they balloon to have a much more detrimental effect on the quality of these games. To go back to my example from the very beginning, Bethesda did not take heed of the warning signs of stagnation after Fallout 4, and their fall from grace is a perfect example of what happens when even the most beloved developers are unwilling or unable to evolve beyond their tried and true formulas. I'm optimistic that FromSoft can avoid this same fate by making the appropriate changes, but only time and their next game will tell. Whew, that was a mouthful. I know this last section went well beyond just talking about the DLC, but I do feel like it is a relevant discussion that needs to be had at this point, and I felt like it was important to include in the video. But before I let you all go, I should probably wrap up my overall thoughts on Shadow of the Erdtree. Shadow of the Erdtree has some of my favorite FromSoft content ever. It's an expansion of staggering size that justifies its lofty price tag thanks to the huge amount of new gear, some incredible level design, stunning soundtrack, and a handful of top-notch boss fights. But all that good stuff is unfortunately spread way too thin in a map that cannot justify being so massive. Too many areas lack compelling content, and some of them just straight up don't have enough content at all. The new Erdtree system feels half-baked, and it turns the opening hours into a tedious collectathon. The story is a mixed bag with a few fascinating reveals and a strong roster of NPCs, but the overall story of Elden Ring now feels like a disjointed mess. The major bosses are generally good and occasionally great, but with some very noticeable and consistent problems throughout the roster that played a major role in my belief that the Souls combat system really needs a shakeup sooner rather than later. Despite all these criticisms, I feel like this video might have come off a little bit more negative than I probably intended. I still think Shadow of the Erdtree is good, but it's the most conflicted I've been about a From release maybe ever. But a single stumble after 15 years of a near spotless record is absolutely nothing to scoff at, and the fact that I even consider it a stumble just goes to show how insanely high the bar is for this company. I'm still eagerly awaiting From Software's next project, and for the first time in a long time, we don't really know what that's gonna be. And that actually has me excited. And now that the final chapter of Elden Ring Saga has been written, we can finally turn our attention to what lies ahead. I look forward to seeing you all there.